It was supposed to be a fresh start for a young boy and his family, moving to a new town and a prestigious school. But soon he found himself facing bullying from classmates, harsh treatment from a teacher, and overwhelming loneliness. When he finally stood up for himself, things took a shocking turn. You won't believe what happened next. Watch till the end to see the powerful lesson he learned, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Drop a comment below about where you're watching from. The heavy silence in the car was a stark contrast to the lively discussions and laughter that had once accompanied this family's long drives. As they entered the new town, the boy watched the unfamiliar streets from the back seat, his face pressed against the glass, taking in every detail of the place that would now be his home. Tall buildings lined the street, their facades pristine and unblemished, hinting at the town's reputation for wealth and sophistication. The sun was dipping low, casting a golden glow across the manicured lawns and perfectly kept sidewalks. The move had been a big decision. His parents had poured everything into making it possible, drawn by the promise of a better life and, especially, better education for their son. The boy had been excited at first, dreaming of new friends, new opportunities, and the chance to learn in a place that his parents often said would open doors for him. But, as they turned into their new neighborhood, that excitement turned into a heavy lump in his stomach. Everything looked so perfect, so different from the lively, bustling neighborhood he'd left behind. "Here we are," his mother said softly, glancing back at him with a smile. Her eyes sparkled with hope and a touch of nervousness, as if she were reassuring herself as much as him. "This is it, our new home." The boy forced a smile, knowing how much this move meant to his parents. They had sacrificed a lot to give him this opportunity, and he didn't want to show any hesitation. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and tried to embrace the change, ignoring the unease twisting in his chest. The house itself was nice, a modest, neat two-story with a small front yard and a towering oak tree that stretched its branches protectively over the roof. It looked like something out of a movie, and he wondered if he'd ever feel truly at home here. The boy could see his parents exchanging hopeful looks, relief evident on their faces as they surveyed their new surroundings. They had made it, against all odds, and they were determined to make this place work. That night, as they unpacked, his parents talked excitedly about the future, about how this town was known for its prestigious schools, safe neighborhoods, and opportunities. He could tell that they believed this was the place where he could thrive, and so he tried to believe it too. The next morning came too soon. He dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, his hands trembling slightly as he tied his shoes. His parents had saved up for months to afford the uniform, and he felt a strange pressure to wear it proudly, as if it symbolized all their hard work. But, despite his best efforts to appear calm, his reflection in the mirror revealed a boy who was nervous, uncertain, and painfully aware of how much was riding on his success here. As they drove to the school, he noticed how different it looked from his old one. The school grounds were enormous, with sprawling green fields, a track, and a massive building that seemed to loom over him as they approached. His mother gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before he got out, whispering words of encouragement that he held on to like a lifeline. But as soon as he stepped through the gates, the difference was palpable. The other kids glanced at him with curiosity, their eyes lingering a bit too long, and he felt the weight of their stares as he made his way inside. His heart raced and he clutched his backpack strap tightly, trying to blend in, trying to be invisible. But he could feel it. He was an outsider here. In his first class, the whispers started. He heard the murmurs, the soft snickers, the sideways glances. A few boys in the back exchanged looks, smirking as they sized him up. He tried to focus on the teacher, tuning out the buzz of voices, but it was impossible to ignore the quiet laughter and the cruel eyes that followed him as he moved. By lunch, the tension had built up to a suffocating level. He sat alone in the cafeteria, picking at his food, too afraid to look up, too afraid to see the disapproving or mocking faces. He could feel the stares, the silent judgment that came from simply existing in this space, from daring to take up space in a school that wasn't meant for him. His stomach churned, and he barely touched his food. When he returned to class, a group of girls passed by, giggling and whispering. One of them muttered something under her breath, loud enough for him to hear, and he felt the sting of humiliation. He wanted to disappear, to shrink into his seat and become invisible. But he knew he couldn't. He had to stay strong, to prove to his parents that he could handle this, even as the reality of his situation began to sink in. As the days passed, the bullying became more subtle but no less painful. The boys in his class would shove him in the hallway, acting as if it were accidental, their laughter echoing in his ears. The girls would make snide remarks, laughing behind their hands, their words cutting through him with a sharpness that left him feeling raw and exposed. And yet, he said nothing. He couldn't bring himself to tell his parents. They had sacrificed so much for him to be here, and he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them. Every night, he would sit at the dinner table, forcing a smile as his parents asked about his day, swallowing down the hurt and fear that had become a constant companion. He would tell them that school was fine, that he was adjusting, that he was happy, but inside, he felt like he was drowning. The silence became his shield, his way of coping with the isolation and cruelty he faced each day. He withdrew into himself, his once bright spirit dimming under the weight of the hostility that surrounded him. He became quiet, reserved, his laughter fading as he tried to blend into the background, hoping that maybe, if he stayed small and silent, they would forget he was there. But his father noticed. He noticed the way his son's shoulders slumped, the way his laughter had faded, the way he seemed to carry an invisible weight on his small shoulders. He tried to ask, tried to reach out, but the boy would only smile weakly and reassure him that everything was fine. Yet the father knew better. He could see the change, the shadow that had settled over his son, and he knew that something was wrong. One night, as the boy lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he wondered if it would ever get better. He wondered if he would ever fit in, if he would ever find a place where he belonged. The ache in his chest was a constant reminder of how out of place he felt, of how much he wished things were different. In the silence of his room, he whispered a promise to himself, a promise to stay strong, to keep going, to prove to himself and to his parents that he was worthy of being here. He would endure the stares, the whispers, the mocking laughter, because he had no other choice. As he drifted into sleep, the father sat in the living room, deep in thought. He knew his son was hiding something, that he was carrying a burden he didn't understand. And, as he watched the moonlight cast shadows across the room, he made a silent vow to find out what was troubling his son, to protect him from whatever darkness had settled over him. For now, both father and son were bound by silence, each carrying their own fears, their own worries. But the father knew that this silence wouldn't last forever, and when the time came, he would be ready to stand by his son's side no matter what he faced. The days turned into weeks, and the boy found himself caught in a cycle of hostility that only seemed to grow stronger with time. He had tried his best to ignore the taunts, the glances, the occasional accidental shove in the hallways. But as each day passed, the tension only seemed to build. He'd learned to keep his head down, to walk with his shoulders hunched, hoping that if he made himself small enough he might avoid being noticed. Yet they noticed him. Every time he walked into class, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. At first, it was just whispers, a few quiet comments, stifled laughter. But soon, those whispers turned into outright hostility. One afternoon, as he made his way to his locker, he felt someone shove him from behind. He stumbled forward, nearly falling, and heard laughter behind him. When he turned, he saw a group of boys, their faces filled with sneering amusement. "Careful," one of them said, barely hiding his grin. "Wouldn't want you to trip and hurt yourself." The boy forced himself to ignore them, turning back to his locker and fumbling with the combination. His hands shook, his heart pounding in his chest, but he managed to open it, grabbing his books and clutching them to his chest like a shield. He didn't look back as he walked away, even though he could feel their eyes on him, feel their mocking laughter following him down the hall. He told himself it was just one incident, that he could handle it. But the shoves became more frequent, the insults more pointed. They found every possible way to remind him that he didn't belong, that he was different. And the worst part was, he began to believe it. He started to think that maybe they were right, that he didn't belong here, that he was somehow less worthy of being in this school. The girls were no kinder. They whispered as he walked past, covering their mouths as they laughed, casting sidelong glances in his direction. They would giggle and point, making comments about his skin, his hair, his clothes. He heard one girl say, "I didn't think they let people like him in here." Another girl snickered and replied, "Maybe they're lowering the standards." He tried to block it out, to pretend that their words didn't sting, but no matter how hard he tried, the hurt seeped in, a constant ache that he carried with him every day. He found himself dreading school, dreading the looks, the laughs, the snide comments. He stopped sitting in the cafeteria, choosing instead to eat his lunch in a quiet corner of the school where no one could find him. And still, he told no one. He swallowed down the pain, the humiliation, forcing a smile when he got home, reassuring his parents that everything was fine. He knew how much this school meant to them, how much they had sacrificed to give him this opportunity. He didn't want to let them down, didn't want them to think he was ungrateful or weak. But the strain of hiding it all took its toll. He became quiet, withdrawn, his once bright spirit dimming under the weight of the cruelty he faced. At night, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would ever escape the loneliness that surrounded him. One day, the bullying reached a new level. As he walked home from school, a group of boys followed him. He tried to ignore them, picking up his pace, but they caught up, surrounding him on the sidewalk. One of them stepped forward, blocking his path, while the others closed in around him. "Where do you think you're going?" the boy sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "Think you're better than us or something?" The boy shook his head, his heart pounding as he glanced around looking for an escape, but they were all around him, their faces twisted in mocking smiles. He knew there was no way out. Before he could react, one of them shoved him hard, and he stumbled, dropping his backpack. Another boy laughed and kicked the backpack away, sending it skidding across the pavement. "Look at him," one of them sneered. "He thinks he's so special, coming here, taking our space." The boy tried to reach for his backpack, but one of the boys blocked him, shoving him back. "What's wrong?" he taunted. "Too good to fight back?" They continued to taunt him, pushing him, laughing as he struggled to get away. He could feel the humiliation burning in his chest, the helplessness rising as they surrounded him. He wanted to fight back, to stand up for himself, but he was outnumbered and the fear was too strong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they grew bored and let him go, laughing as they walked away, leaving him standing there, his backpack scuffed and dirty on the ground. He picked it up, his hands shaken, and walked home, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. When he got home, his mother asked him about his day, but he just smiled weakly, muttering something about homework as he disappeared into his room. He didn't want her to see the bruises, didn't want her to know how much it hurt. He told himself that he could handle it, that he didn't need to burden his parents with his problems. But each day became harder than the last. The weight of the bullying, the isolation, the constant reminder that he didn't belong, it all pressed down on him, suffocating him. He stopped speaking up in class, stopped trying to make friends, retreating further into himself. His laughter faded, replaced by a dull, empty silence. His father noticed the change, the way his son no longer looked him in the eye, the way he seemed to avoid talking about school. He tried to ask, tried to reach out, but the boy always brushed it off, insisting that everything was fine. But the father wasn't convinced. He could see the shadows in his son's eyes, the way he seemed to carry an invisible burden. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, his father noticed the way his son picked at his food, barely eating. The boy's face was drawn, his shoulders slumped, and there was a heaviness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Are you sure everything's okay at school?" his father asked gently, trying to keep the concern out of his voice. The boy looked up, forcing a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, Dad, everything's fine. Just a lot of homework, you know?" But his father wasn't convinced. He watched his son closely, noting the way he avoided eye contact, the way his hands trembled slightly as he pushed his food around on his plate. There was something wrong. He could feel it. After dinner, the father sat alone in the living room, deep in thought. He knew his son was hiding something, but he didn't know what, and the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he needed to find out. The next morning, as his son got ready for school, the father made a decision. He would follow his son to school just for a day to see if he could figure out what was going on. He didn't want to invade his privacy, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As his son walked out the door, the father waited a few moments before following him, keeping a safe distance as he trailed behind. He watched as his son walked down the street, his shoulders hunched, his steps hesitant. There was a heaviness to his movements, a reluctance that spoke volumes. When his son reached the school gates, the father saw the way the other students looked at him, the way they seemed to glance at him with disdain, the subtle sneers and whispers that followed him as he made his way inside. The father's heart clenched as he watched, anger and sadness mixing in his chest. For the rest of the day, he watched from a distance, observing the way his son moved through the school, always on the outskirts, always trying to stay out of sight. He saw the shoves, the sneers, the laughter that followed him wherever he went. And with each passing moment, his heart ached more, the realization sinking in that his son was facing this torment alone. By the time the school day ended, the father knew he couldn't keep quiet any longer. He couldn't let his son suffer in silence, couldn't stand by while he was treated this way. But he also knew that he needed to approach this carefully, that his son might not be ready to open up just yet. As they walked home that evening, the father kept his thoughts to himself, silently vowing to protect his son, to stand by him, and to find a way to end the pain he was facing. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the struggle was far from over. But he also knew that he wouldn't let his son face it alone. The boy's days had settled into a relentless pattern of loneliness and quiet suffering. He had grown used to the taunts of his classmates, the laughter, the shoves. They hurt, but he learned to ignore them, to block out the sting of their words, even though each remark cut him deeper than he let on. But nothing could have prepared him for the harshness of his teacher. At first, it was subtle. His teacher, Mr. Thompson, would ignore his raised hand in class, turning to other students instead. The boy thought he might have been imagining it, hoping that his teacher just hadn't noticed him. But as the days went on, it became clear that Mr. Thompson's disregard was intentional. During one lesson, the boy tried to answer a question, hoping to impress his teacher, to show him that he deserved to be here just as much as anyone else. He raised his hand high, feeling a spark of hope as he met Mr. Thompson's gaze, but instead of calling on him, Mr. Thompson looked away, a slight smirk on his face, and picked another student, as if the boy didn't exist at all. At first, he brushed it off. He told himself that maybe Mr. Thompson had just overlooked him. But the pattern continued, and soon Mr. Thompson's behavior grew bolder, more deliberate. One afternoon, while explaining a math concept, Mr. Thompson paused in front of the boy's desk, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at him. "I wonder if you even understand this," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "This might be a bit too advanced for someone like you." The boy felt his face flush with embarrassment as the class snickered. He wanted to sink into his chair, to disappear, but he forced himself to meet Mr. Thompson's gaze, refusing to let the teacher see how much his words hurt. From that moment on, Mr. Thompson seemed to make it his mission to single the boy out. He would call on him unexpectedly, knowing he hadn't had time to prepare, and then shake his head in disappointment when the boy struggled to answer. He would make passing comments about effort and standards, each word laced with a subtle cruelty that left the boy feeling worthless. The other students noticed. They began to follow Mr. Thompson's lead, laughing openly when he made a mistake, whispering taunts when he stumbled over his words. It was as if Mr. Thompson had given them permission to treat him as less than, and they eagerly took the opportunity. As the weeks went on, the boy's spirit grew heavier. He dreaded going to Mr. Thompson's class, dreaded the humiliation that awaited him. He could feel himself shrinking, his confidence eroding with every passing day. One afternoon, Mr. Thompson assigned a project, asking each student to present their work in front of the class. The boy spent hours preparing, determined to prove himself, to show Mr. Thompson that he was capable, that he belonged. He rehearsed his presentation over and over, memorizing each word, each point, hoping that this time he might earn his teacher's approval. When his turn finally came, he walked to the front of the class, clutching his notes tightly. His hands trembled as he spoke, but he pushed through, ignoring the snickers from the back of the room. He could feel Mr. Thompson's eyes on him, could sense his impatience, but he kept going, determined to finish. When he reached the end, he looked at Mr. Thompson, searching for a sign of approval, hoping for a word of encouragement. But Mr. Thompson simply stared at him, his expression blank. "That was interesting," he said finally, his voice cold. "But I think you could have done better. Maybe if you'd put in a bit more effort, you'd be able to keep up with the rest of the class." The boy's heart sank as the class erupted in laughter. He felt his face flush with shame, the sting of Mr. Thompson's words cutting deep. He had tried so hard, had put everything he had into that presentation, and it still wasn't enough. He was never enough. As he walked back to his seat, he could feel the weight of their laughter pressing down on him, each snicker a reminder of his failure. He kept his head down, fighting back tears, refusing to let them see how much it hurt. That evening, as he sat in his room, he wondered if he would ever escape this cycle of humiliation. He wondered if he would ever be good enough for Mr. Thompson, if he would ever prove himself worthy of being here. The thought filled him with despair, and for the first time he found himself doubting whether he could keep going. The next day, he tried to avoid Mr. Thompson's gaze, hoping to slip through the lesson unnoticed. But Mr. Thompson had other plans. Halfway through the class, he called on the boy, his voice sharp and demanding. "Do you even understand what we're discussing?" he sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Or is this too difficult for you?" The boy tried to answer, stammering as he struggled to form a coherent response. But before he could finish, Mr. Thompson cut him off, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "I'm not surprised." The boy's face burned with humiliation as the class laughed, their jeers echoing in his ears. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, to escape the crushing weight of their judgment. But he forced himself to sit still, to keep his head up, even as his heart ached with shame. He told himself that he would get through this, that he would endure. But with each passing day, the pain grew harder to bear, the weight of Mr. Thompson's cruelty pressing down on him, suffocating him. He wished he could talk to someone, to tell them what he was going through. But he was afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of disappointing his parents. So he kept silent, swallowing down the hurt, carrying the weight of his suffering alone. And yet, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the bitterness in Mr. Thompson's voice, the sneers, the cold, dismissive looks, all of it left scars, invisible marks that he carried with him each day, a reminder of his isolation, his loneliness. One afternoon, as he left Mr. Thompson's class, he overheard a group of students whispering behind him. They laughed, their voices filled with mockery, and he caught snippets of their conversation, words that stung like a slap to the face. "He thinks he's so special," one of them sneered, "like he actually belongs here." Another laughed. "He doesn't get it. This isn't a place for people like him." The boy clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger, a brief, burning desire to stand up for himself, to shout back, to tell them that they were wrong. But the words died on his lips, and he kept walking, his head down, the anger fading into a familiar ache of defeat. He felt himself slipping further into silence, retreating into himself, each day a battle to hold on to the last shreds of his confidence, his self-worth. But Mr. Thompson's cruelty, the relentless bullying, the isolation, it was all too much, and he felt himself losing, felt himself being crushed under the weight of it all. In his darkest moments, he wondered if things would ever change, if he would ever find a way to escape. But for now, he had no choice but to endure, to carry the pain in silence, hoping that one day, somehow, he might find a way out of the darkness. The boy's change in behavior had not gone unnoticed. His father had watched over the past weeks as his once bright, enthusiastic son became a shadow of himself, retreating deeper into silence with every passing day. The laughter that used to fill their home had faded, replaced by a quietness that felt heavy, almost oppressive. And every time his father tried to ask about school, the boy would give vague, unconvincing answers, his eyes downcast, avoiding any meaningful conversation. At first, his father thought it was just the natural stress of adjusting to a new school, especially one as challenging and prestigious as this. But as the weeks went by, his concern grew, gnawing at him until it was impossible to ignore. There was something else going on, something his son was hiding. The question was, what? One evening, after dinner, the father found himself watching his son more closely than usual. The boy sat at the table, his shoulders hunched, barely touching his food, his gaze fixed on his plate. He seemed to be somewhere else entirely, lost in thoughts that he was clearly reluctant to share. His father's heart ached as he observed the quiet sadness in his son's eyes, a sadness that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Hey, buddy," he said gently, trying to keep his tone light. "How's everything going at school? Made any friends yet?" The boy looked up, forcing a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's fine," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a lot of homework." The father nodded, though he didn't believe a word of it. He could see the strain in his son's expression, the way he seemed to be holding something back, as if he were carrying a burden he didn't know how to share. He wanted to press further, to ask the questions that had been building up in his mind, but he held back, sensing that his son wasn't ready to talk. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he found himself replaying their conversation over and over, searching for clues, trying to understand what could be causing his son so much pain. The silence, the withdrawal, the way his son's laughter had faded into something hollow, it all pointed to something deeper, something that went beyond the typical challenges of adjusting to a new school. After a restless night, he made a decision. If his son wouldn't open up to him, then he would find out what was going on himself. He didn't like the idea of invading his son's privacy, but his worry outweighed his hesitation. He couldn't sit back and do nothing while his son suffered in silence. The next morning, he waited until his son left for school before slipping out of the house a few minutes later. He kept a safe distance, following quietly as his son made his way down the street. The boy walked slowly, his shoulders slumped, his head down, as if he were trying to make himself invisible. The father felt a pang of sadness as he watched, realizing just how much his son's spirit had changed since they had moved here. When they reached the school, the father stayed outside the gates, watching from a distance as his son disappeared into the building. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to see, but he knew that he needed answers. He waited patiently, keeping an eye on the students as they filed into the school, noting the way some of them glanced at his son with smirks and whispers. There was a coldness, an undercurrent of hostility in their expressions that sent a chill down his spine. He waited outside for hours, his eyes fixed on the school building, hoping to catch a glimpse of his son during lunch or between classes. Finally, he saw him, walking through the courtyard with his head down, clutching his backpack tightly to his chest. A group of boys trailed behind him, their laughter carrying across the courtyard, and he noticed the way his son seemed to shrink in their presence, his steps quickening as he tried to avoid them. The father's heart clenched as he watched the scene unfold. He saw one of the boys reach out, shoving his son lightly, pretending it was a joke, laughing as the boy stumbled forward. He saw the way his son kept his head down, refusing to look back, his shoulders tense with fear and shame. And in that moment, the father knew This was more than just school stress. His son was being bullied. Anger surged within him, a fierce, protective anger that made his hands clench into fists. How dare they treat his son this way? How dare they make him feel like he didn't belong, like he was somehow less than them? He wanted to march into the school, to confront the boys who were tormenting his son, to demand answers from the teachers and staff who had allowed this to happen. But he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that confronting the students would only make things worse for his son, that he needed to approach this carefully if he wanted to truly help him. He stayed outside the school for the rest of the day, watching as his son moved through the halls, always on the outskirts, always trying to stay invisible. As the final bell rang and the students began to file out of the school, he waited for his son, determined to walk home with him, to be there for him, even if he couldn't yet share what he had seen. When his son emerged, he looked more tired than ever, his face pale, his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his young frame. They walked home in silence, the father keeping his questions to himself, giving his son the space he needed. But as they reached the front door, he placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it reassuringly. "Just remember, I'm here for you," he said softly. "If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here." The boy nodded, offering a faint, grateful smile, though his eyes still held a sadness that the father couldn't ignore. That night, as his son went to bed, the father sat alone in the living room, his mind racing with thoughts, plans, and worries. He knew he couldn't let this continue, couldn't stand by while his son faced this torment alone, but he also knew that his son wasn't ready to open up, that he was holding on to his pain, unwilling or unable to share it. And so the father resolved to be patient, to wait for the right moment, to support his son in whatever way he could. He would be there, watching, ready to protect him when the time came. As the days went on, he continued to observe, to watch for signs, hoping that his son might one day trust him enough to share the truth. He knew it would take time, that his son's wounds ran deep, but he was determined to help him heal, to stand by him no matter what. And as he watched his son retreat further into silence, the father prepared himself for the battle that lay ahead, a battle that he knew he would face with unwavering strength and resolve. The days continued to drag on, each one a repeat of the last. The boy's silent suffering became a routine, his days filled with taunts, dismissive glances, and the cold indifference of those around him. But something inside him had shifted. A small spark of defiance began to grow, fueled by the anger and frustration that he had buried for so long. He was tired of being treated as less, tired of staying silent while his classmates and even his teacher demeaned him. One morning, as he looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, he barely recognized the boy staring back. He saw the exhaustion in his own eyes, the quiet sadness that seemed to weigh down his every step. But he also saw a spark, a flicker of strength that reminded him that he wasn't powerless. He had a voice, and he had a right to be here, just as much as anyone else. When he walked into Mr. Thompson's classroom that day, he felt a sense of resolve that he hadn't felt before. He sat down at his desk, steeling himself, prepared for whatever would come. He knew that Mr. Thompson would find a way to single him out, as he always did, but this time he wouldn't stay silent. Halfway through the lesson, Mr. Thompson paused, his gaze settling on the boy with that familiar look of disdain. "Perhaps you could answer this one," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he gestured toward the equation on the board. "Let's see if you can keep up with the rest of the class." The boy's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He met Mr. Thompson's gaze, feeling the weight of his classmates' eyes on him, waiting for him to falter, to embarrass himself. But he took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady and clear. "I can answer it," he said, his tone measured, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd treat me with the same respect you give everyone else." A hush fell over the room, his words hanging in the air, and he could feel the shock radiating from his classmates. Mr. Thompson's expression shifted, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. He had never been challenged like this, especially not by a student, and the boy could see the fury simmering beneath his teacher's cold stare. "Excuse me." Mr. Thompson's voice was low, dangerously controlled. "Did you just tell me how to do my job?" "I'm just asking for respect," the boy replied, his voice unwavering. "That's all." For a moment, Mr. Thompson simply stared at him, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Then, in a swift, angry movement, he stepped toward the boy, his face twisted in a rage that seemed barely contained. He grabbed the boy by the collar, yanking him out of his seat, his grip tight and unyielding. "Let's see if you can talk back to me now," Mr. Thompson snarled, dragging the boy toward the classroom door. "Since you're so bold, let's have a little chat, shall we?" The boy struggled against his teacher's hold, his heart racing as he was pulled into the hallway. He felt a wave of panic rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, refusing to let Mr. Thompson see his fear. He had finally stood up for himself, and he wasn't going to back down now. Mr. Thompson didn't stop in the hallway. Instead, he continued down the corridor, his grip never loosening as he dragged the boy toward the bathroom. The few students who passed by looked away, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to interfere. It was as if they were afraid to acknowledge what was happening, to step in and put a stop to it. When they reached the bathroom, Mr. Thompson shoved the door open, pulling the boy inside before releasing his grip on his collar. The boy stumbled, catching himself on the sink, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as he tried to steady himself. "Do you think you're special?" Mr. Thompson sneered, his voice low and filled with contempt. "Do you think you deserve some kind of special treatment just because you're different?" The boy met his gaze, his fear fading as a surge of anger took its place. He clenched his fists, refusing to look away, refusing to let Mr. Thompson intimidate him. "All I want is to be treated fairly," he said, his voice strong, defiant, "just like everyone else." Mr. Thompson's face twisted in fury, and before the boy could react, he grabbed him by the shoulders, forcing him toward one of the bathroom stalls. The boy struggled, his heart pounding as he realized what was about to happen. "You want to talk back to me?" Mr. Thompson growled, his grip tightening. "Let's see how brave you are now." With a forceful shove, he pushed the boy's head toward the toilet, holding him down, his hand pressing firmly against the back of his neck. The boy fought against him, his body thrashing as he tried to break free, but Mr. Thompson's grip was too strong. Humiliation washed over him, mingling with the rage and fear that bubbled inside. He couldn't believe this was happening, couldn't believe that a teacher, someone who was supposed to guide and protect him, would treat him with such cruelty. But he refused to give up, refused to let Mr. Thompson win. Just as the pressure on the back of his neck became unbearable, the bathroom door swung open and his father's voice filled the room. "Let go of him," his father shouted, his voice filled with a fury that sent chills down the boy's spine. "Right now." Mr. Thompson froze, his grip loosening just enough for the boy to pull away, gasping for air as he stumbled backward. His father stepped forward, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief as he looked from his son to Mr. Thompson, his eyes blazing with a protective rage. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" his father demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "You're supposed to be his teacher, his guide, and you're treating him like this?" Mr. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked uncertain, his arrogance replaced by a flicker of fear as he realized the gravity of what he had done. I was just," he stammered, his voice trailing off as he looked away, his face pale. Without another word, the father pulled out his phone, dialing the police. His hands were steady, his voice calm but firm as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. He spoke in measured tones, detailing what he had witnessed, leaving no room for ambiguity. The boy stood by his side, still shaken, but feeling a surge of relief and gratitude as he realized that he wasn't alone. Within minutes, police officers arrived, their faces stern as they entered the bathroom, taking in the scene before them. Mr. Thompson tried to defend himself, to claim that it was all a misunderstanding, but the father's testimony was clear and irrefutable. He recounted every detail, his voice unwavering as he described the cruelty and abuse his son had endured. The officers listened, their expressions hardening as they understood the full extent of Mr. Thompson's actions. They placed him in handcuffs, ignoring his protests as they led him out of the school, the whispers of students and teachers following in their wake. The boy watched as Mr. Thompson was escorted away, feeling a sense of vindication, of justice that he had longed for. As they left the school, the father wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, pulling him close. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice filled with regret. "I should have seen this sooner. I should have protected you." The boy looked up at his father, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being here, for standing up for me." They walked home in silence, the weight of the day's events settling over them, but for the first time in a long time, the boy felt a glimmer of hope. He knew that things wouldn't be easy, that he still had a long road ahead, but he also knew that he didn't have to face it alone. As they reached their front door, the father looked down at his son, a gentle smile on his face. "You're strong," he said quietly, "and I'm so proud of you." The boy smiled back, a feeling of warmth filling his chest as he realized that he was finally free from the pain and humiliation that had haunted him for so long. He had stood up, he had fought back, and with his father by his side, he knew that he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the days following Mr. Thompson's arrest, the school became a whirlwind of gossip, shock, and confusion. News of what had happened spread quickly, and the boy's classmates whispered in hushed voices, their previous mocking replaced with guilt or avoidance. Some of them would glance his way in the halls, their expressions filled with a strange mix of shame and fear, as if realizing for the first time the impact of their own cruelty. The administration acted swiftly. The principal called an assembly to address the incident, speaking in vague terms about professional conduct and the responsibility of educators. He assured the students and staff that Mr. Thompson's actions were being handled legally and that the school was committed to creating a safe, respectful environment for everyone. But the boy could sense the unease lingering in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement of the school's failure to protect him. His father remained by his side through it all, attending every meeting with the school, speaking firmly to administrators, and ensuring that they took full responsibility for allowing the bullying and mistreatment to go on for so long. The police investigation into Mr. Thompson's actions continued, and more details emerged, revealing a history of complaints from other students who had suffered under his harsh, prejudiced treatment. It was clear that his behavior had been tolerated for far too long, and now, finally, he was facing the consequences. Despite the chaos around him, the boy began to feel a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time, he felt a sense of validation, a recognition that he had been wronged and that he deserved better. He no longer had to endure Mr. Thompson's scorn, nor the constant ridicule of his classmates. He had faced his fears, stood up for himself, and with his father's unwavering support, he had reclaimed his dignity. One afternoon, his father took him out for a quiet walk in the park, hoping to escape the tension of the school and the lingering stares of the community. They walked in silence for a while, the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet filling the comfortable quiet. After a few moments, his father spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "You know," he began, looking down at his son, "I've never been more proud of you than I am now. You went through something no one should ever have to face, and you handled it with so much strength." The boy looked up, feeling a warmth spread through his chest as he took in his father's words. He had spent so long feeling weak, powerless, as if he were trapped in a situation he couldn't escape. But now, hearing his father's pride, he began to see himself in a new light. "Thank you," he replied, his voice quiet. I didn't think I could do it. I was so scared." His father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, giving him a gentle squeeze. "You were brave," he said. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about facing that fear and doing what's right, no matter how hard it is." The boy nodded, feeling a newfound sense of confidence growing within him. He realized that he had learned something invaluable through this ordeal. He had learned to believe in himself, to stand up for his own worth, and to trust that he was deserving of respect and kindness. As they continued walking, his father spoke again, his tone serious. "Listen, I know this experience was painful, but it's important that you remember, no one has the right to make you feel small or unworthy. You deserve to be treated with respect, no matter where you are or who you're with. Never forget that." The boy nodded, absorbing his father's words. He felt a sense of peace settling over him, a calmness that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that he would carry this lesson with him, that he would never again allow anyone to diminish him or make him feel less than. In the weeks that followed, he slowly began to rebuild his sense of self. The school arranged counseling sessions to help him process the trauma he had endured, and with his father's encouragement, he began to open up, sharing his experiences and working through the pain that he had buried for so long. He learned to express his feelings, to trust that his voice mattered, and to find strength in his own resilience. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson faced formal charges for his actions, and the school made changes to its policies, implementing new protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. The administration apologized to the boy and his father, acknowledging their failure to protect him and promising to do better. Though it couldn't erase the pain he had endured, it offered a small sense of closure, a reassurance that his suffering hadn't been in vain. As the boy returned to his classes, he noticed a shift in the way his classmates treated him. Some of them offered quiet apologies, their faces filled with remorse as they realized the impact of their words and actions. Others kept their distance, their expressions a mixture of guilt and unease. Though the boy was hesitant to trust them, he felt a sense of satisfaction in knowing that they could no longer ignore his presence, no longer pretend that he didn't belong. In time, he found new friends, students who valued him for who he was, who saw beyond the color of his skin and accepted him as he was. With their support and with the unwavering love of his father, he began to heal, reclaiming the confidence and joy that had been taken from him. One evening, as he sat with his father on the porch, watching the sun set over their neighborhood, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He was grateful for his father's strength, for his belief in him, and for the lessons he had learned through this ordeal. He knew that he was stronger now, that he had faced something that could have broken him, and had come out the other side with a renewed sense of purpose and self-worth. "Thank you, Dad," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "for everything." His father smiled, pulling him into a hug. "I'll always be here for you," he replied, his voice soft but steady, "no matter what." And as the boy looked out at the horizon, he felt a renewed hope for the future, a belief that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage, knowing that he was worthy of respect, of kindness, and of a place in this world. In the end, the boy learned that courage and resilience could overcome even the darkest challenges. With his father's support, he found strength and self-worth, and he knew he would never face these struggles alone. This story reminds us of the power of standing up for ourselves and the importance of family. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself? We'd love to hear from you.